This is Mid-Atlantic Women in Agriculture's Wednesday webinar. Our presentation today is CSA Operators. Our presenters are Ellixson and Paul Goeringer. This presentation has been pre-recorded, so they are unable to answer questions during the presentation, but both presenters have provided their email address. A special thank you to our sponsor, Mid-Atlantic Farm Credit. And all archived presentations, along with all upcoming presentations, can be found at our website. Thanks so much for listening.
So this is just a disclaimer. Although I am an attorney, today's presentation should not be construed as legal advice. And if you do have specific issues that are unique to you and your operation, you should definitely consult an attorney. And we also have resources if you need help finding someone. And then ALEI is part of the Empower collaborative partnership that is between University of Maryland College Park, University of Maryland Baltimore, and it brings all these expertises together, and the Ag Education Initiative is under that. And this is the Ag Education Initiative. That's our website, our Twitter handle, our Facebook, and our email address. At the end of both of our presentations, Paul and I have our contact information, so you can specifically reach out to us if you have any questions after today's webinar or anything else legally related that we can help you with. So to start, how many of you want to protect your farm and your CSA offerings if you're a farm? I'm guessing most of you probably do. And do you have a contract already in place? Well, if your answer is no, wouldn't you like to consider having one? And however, if it's yes, wouldn't you like to know if you have included everything necessary to protect yourself and operate efficiently? And I'm guessing either way, you guys all might want to know why you would actually consider having a contract for your CSA at all. Well, up to 70% of CSAs actually operate as a sole proprietorship or general partnership, exposing the farmland and personal assets to claims arising out of the business. So your own personal assets are not actually protected if you look at what is actually going on across the U.S. as far as CSA operations. And this comes from the 2009 survey of community-supported agriculture producers conducted by the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. So if you do fall into one of these areas, you're actually not alone at all. And this survey also showed that many CSA operators recognize concerns that a more legalistic farm organization may create an undesired relationship between the CSA and its members. And this is obviously across the board. The most desirable relationship for most CSAs are a very personable relationship. Your consumers want to know you as the farmer, and as the consumer you want to know your farmer. Having something in writing can kind of put up some walls and can kind of scare both the operator and the consumer. So it's not actually an ideal situation, and we are aware of that. But with that said, the survey showed that a third of CSA farmers are hesitant, like I said, to put the terms of their CSA in writing because it appears untrustworthy, and it seems like you have something to hide. And again, we do understand that, and that's kind of what we're speaking to today, that if you can communicate more and get everything out in the open, that your consumers will also realize that you are trying to protect yourself as well as a business. So legal issues do arise from not using written agreements. Farmers may think that discussing these risks of their CSA on their website, Facebook, Twitter, other social media will protect them against disappointed customers. But unfortunately, this may not be the case. So, for example, this is a real-life experience. This actually happened. 3 CSA farms failed to produce in Illinois and Wisconsin after a severe drought in 2011. An upset customer called an attorney wanting to know how he could get his $560 CSA share refunded because he didn't receive any of his share. So whether the farmer owed the customer turned on a non-existent sales agreement and whether the lack of vegetables materialized from the risk shared between the farmer and the customer. So because there was no written agreement, this created a huge issue for this customer. and unfortunately also for the farmer because of the drought. So why isn't having information on your website or Facebook page enough? Well, one of the reasons is due to this contracting rule called the parole evidence rule, or also sometimes known as the four corners rule. It's a contracting rule used by courts that can limit inclusion of evidence that clarifies a contract. So the idea is that all your negotiations, everything that's understood between the farmer and the consumer are reflected into the final document, so i.e. the contract or the membership agreement. For example, Farmer Paul has a warning that weather may affect production on his website, but unfortunately he has not included it in his membership contract. The court may rule that Farmer Paul's warning is not actually included in the agreement, and therefore the customer is not held to be in warning of weather issues concerning the production. So if you have information that's on a Facebook page and it's different from the website page, it's different from what you're putting on Twitter, and it's not actually in a membership agreement, the court can decide that it's not going to look at any of that external evidence. It's only going to look at what's within those four corners of the membership agreement. So by including in the contract, you clarify potential areas of dispute. And yes, we realize you prefer the document to be short and sweet and to the point. Short and sweet and to the point can also come back to hurt you if you don't include all the necessary areas that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then Paul's going to go ahead and further clarify that in the model contract. But you can also do this if you want to clarify and not have everything in a membership agreement to make it a little bit smaller. You can do this by using appendixes or referencing back to spots on your website and including copies for potential members. So you might include something in your membership that says, and includes all information that's listed on such and such tab on the website, or any updates that could be included from our Facebook page, something to that extent. So you can either type in through the chat box, or I'll wait a few seconds to see if anyone types in, but how do you currently address these issues, surpluses or shortages, pickups, harvest schedules? Do you have a U-pick operation, growing practice notifications? Feel free to write any of that into the chat box. If not, I'll wait about 20 seconds and you guys can move along, or I'll move along, sorry. All right. Well, there's various different ways that farmers have addressed this. I've got a lot of different things from different farmers. So there's no right or wrong answer. And Lakeisha, I think that's how you pronounce your name. Sorry if I mispronounced that. This webinar will be recorded, so you can look at it later. Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to go over a few sample contracts briefly, and again, you have access to my presentation and you can look at these in more depth later, but I'm going to briefly go over a few of the key points of things not to do or things that can bring issues in a membership agreement. All right, so this is sample contract number 1, and it seems up here you have the cost of the shares, name, address, phone number, email, and then pickup times and spots, and then a signature. So first thing that I see is there is not enough information in this member contract unless this is just a cover page. It includes the membership fees, name and information of the member, and then the options for pickup. However, what's not included is what happens in a time of surplus. What happens when you have more than enough vegetables? You had more rain that year. What happens in a time of shortage or just a devastating year? Maybe there was a tornado that came through. Unfortunately, these things really do happen. None of that is addressed. And then the details and definition of what each share is. What are you getting in that share? Is it purely vegetables? If so, what kind of vegetables? You may not have specifics, but there are general items that you're going to produce. Is it fruit? Is it meat? Are you working with maybe a local beef grower, or do you have chickens? Are you going to include eggs in that at all? And then also growing practices. And I know that this is something that consumers are very aware of and very concerned about. Are you organic? Are you not? Are you using pesticides? I mean, this is something to also include in that contract, to also let your farmers know that this isn't something to scare them away. This is something that you're just trying to inform them about. And in the end, they're going to understand that. They're going to want to know too. So moving on to sample contract number 2, I realize it's a little hard to see, but I'll go over it in the next slide here. But again, you have your name, address, information. They actually provide for an email here for the consumer, the amount paid, the date, and then several different choices in shares. So whether that's a full share, biweekly, weekly half, early spring, they have definitely a lot of options here. And then it looks like one pickup site, and then the shareholder agreement. And then I will talk about what this highlighted portion says in the next slide here. So again, it includes the membership fees, name and information, the one option for pickup, and this one does have more details and definitions of what each share is. So that is a plus on this one. However, again, it doesn't include what happens in a time of surplus, in a time of shortage, growing practices, occurrence of weather problems, and effect on pickup. So they had one pickup site, but what happens if, unfortunately in Maryland, we have times where we're snowed in, or even across different places across the country. What happens if there's a flood or things that come up? Are you always going to be able to make that pickup? Then what happens if the consumer's not able to make that pickup? That's coming to the highlighted area, and the issue there is it stated that someone else can actually pick up the share, but they didn't state under what terms and conditions that's possible. So this can bring up a lot of issues when people actually steal CSA shares. They can show up and say, I'm picking up Bob's share, and Bob's a pretty generic name, and Bob's share gets handed over to an unknown individual. So maybe making sure there's some communication between the consumer and the person that he or she is having step in to pick up for them needs to happen. Or maybe the consumer needs to email you with who's picking up my share, and then they have to show an ID. Because unfortunately, we're addressing these issues because these are things that have actually come up. And then this one, very hard to see. I apologize for that. They have early sign-up share, and then they have an agreement, again, name, address, information, and then they have a first pickup delivery location and second pickup delivery location in blank spaces. Go ahead and move on and dissect this one a little bit. The same things we've been seeing that are fairly common: membership fees included, name and information of the member, acceptance and notice of weather issues. That was added into this one. But what's not included: occurrence of surplus or shortage, again, growing practices. They didn't put the pickup location, which could be confusing unless that portion's explained further. And then information on what types of vegetables might be in the share. Again, more details about what the share is. And then sample contract number 4. This one looks a little bit more thorough. They do address what's in the share right here. And then the season, you got May 18th through October 26th. We haven't seen that before in the other examples I've shown. And then it says the time span of CSA, so 24 weeks. And then cost and payment method and mailing address where you can send your payment. Again, you've got name, phone number, email address, share prices, share types. They have a U-pick option, and then a pickup location, and then it looks like a pickup on the farm, another U-pick option, and then the CSA commitment statement, understanding what happens and that weather can affect produce. So kind of went over everything we've been saying already. You got membership fees, name and information of member details, definition of what each share is, the pickup options. What's not included, again, is surplus or shortage. This hasn't been addressed yet. You haven't seen growing practices or occurrence of weather problems and effect on pickup. And again, they have that statement of acknowledgement, but simply stating that the member acknowledges the issues, but they don't go further into detail on what would happen during inclement weather. Do you still get your share? Will it be less? Will it be, maybe that week of inclement weather you don't get your share? More details probably need to be laid out to further explain the situation, and then listing the share and amount of items and not weight. And what should it be? Should it be item? Should it be weight? If it's going to be weight, Maryland has specific scaling items that you'll have to abide by as far as getting your scale checked. And then how will the U-pick option be determined? That seemed a little unclear to me in that contract. And then we'll skip through a few of these. We're seeing a lot of the same things. And then we'll go over number 7 real quick. And then I have a sample one that I'm going to let you guys pick apart a little bit. Again, you can write it into the chat box. I'll give you about 30 seconds here shortly when we get to it, and kind of see what you can pick up on after you've heard me kind of talk and items to look for, and see if you're picking up on what to look for. You have name, contact information, very important. Pickup site, circle 1. These are crossed out because they're specific names. I don't want to pick on anybody. And then CSA pricing. You also have other options. You have a cookbook, and then a donation pledge, and then you have share amount, bag fee, total due, and then you have your CSA shareholder agreement. Again, one of those acknowledgments. Again, this one has also very little information. We're seeing the same things. You got the fee, the name and information of the member, pickup location. What we're not seeing, again, is occurrence of surplus or shortage, the details or definition of what the share is, growing practices, or discussion on weather. And then, again, they had another instance in this one where someone else can pick up your share, and how do you monitor that? So if you're going to allow someone else to pick up your member's share, you're going to want to make sure that there's a procedure there to make sure that the member does get their share. So now it's your turn. Now it's your turn. I will show a sample for a few minutes. Anyone can just write in the chat box. Tell me what you see, what you don't see. I'll give you about 30 seconds to a minute, and then I'll go ahead and walk through it. And this will be our last one that I'll walk through before I hand it over to Paul. I'll go ahead and see if I did my job here and taught you guys anything. Awesome, guys. You guys nailed it. Yep, no pickup location. It's not specific. We have no idea what's in the share, like Billy Joe pointed out. Is it meats, veggies, fruits? What is it? Good job, guys. Thanks for participating. I know it's hard on webinars. Yeah, just not enough information. We saw the membership fee again, name and information. We saw a very vague pickup location. And then the things we didn't see. I'm pretty sure everyone we've looked at up until this point, we didn't see occurrence of surplus or shortage. What happens? Details and definition of what the share is that Billy Joe pointed out. And again, no growing practices. This seems to be the common theme in the sample contracts that we've been looking at. And then, again, an issue, just because the contract says that the member acknowledges the risk may not be enough to protect yourself. You need to lay out in more detail what you will do in the event of the weather, in the event of a shortage, in the event of a surplus, in the event that maybe the member can't pick up their share. What will you do? And kind of plan for those things. And then planning extra crops to prevent risk. In that contract, I don't think you could see it very well, but they were saying that to prevent risk, they were going to plant extra crops. Well, even if you do plant extra crops, it's not a way to correct for shortage or weather issues, because you're still going to have those issues with those extra planted crops. So I see where they were going with that, and it's good intentions. But again, you're going to have the same issues. If weather comes through, it's going to wipe out those extra crops just as well. It's going to wipe out the regular harvest. So just things to start thinking about if you haven't already thought about these issues.
So Ashley's kind of led you through some of the contracts that we found online that Maryland CSAs were utilizing already that kind of had some issues with it. And I'll give a little bit of background on how this project developed on my next slide, if I can get my next slide to come up. Yeah, so we did this as a part of a project that was funded through the Ag Marketing Service. It was funded through Federal State Marketing Improvement Program. We just completed the grant. We're finalizing the final report that will go out kind of to the state and some other stakeholders talking about some of the issues that we found as we looked at this. But we did a series of workshops over this last spring when it really wasn't CSA time, but it was a part of the grant, so we had to get it done. And we had some sponsors with that. It was Mid-Atlantic Farm Credit and then Maryland Crop Insurance Education Program that includes myself, Howard Leathers, Maryland Department of Agriculture, and then the Risk Management Agency. And when we developed this grant, there were partners in the grant. The main lead on the grant was the Department of Ag and Resource Economics, where Ashley and I work. And then it was partnered with Maryland Department of Agriculture, the Ag Law Education Initiative that we're both also a part of, Maryland Farm Bureau, and Mid-Atlantic Farm Credit also helped out on it. I need to give my disclaimer real quick. I am an attorney. Nothing I say on this webinar, even though it's being recorded, can be construed as legal advice. I hope we're all good on that, so we'll continue on. And the other thing I need to point out is, as a part of this, we also host a blog at aglaw.umd.edu. It has myself on there talking about Farm Bill, farm policy, ag law issues. Ashley and Sarah discuss ag law issues. We have a couple other people to help post stuff on there. And you can sign up for updates right there, enter your email address. Now, on to the part that you actually want to hear. As looking at this, how many of you consider your CSA as some sort of risk management tool? And you don't have to type an answer in on this, but how many of you think of it as some form of risk management? In a way, it really is a risk management tool because it reduces the need for borrowed capital. You have a ready market for some of your crops, and there potentially are other benefits available in CSAs. And the whole idea behind CSAs when they got started was this idea of sharing risk. And although we share risk in these things, there are common issues that can potentially arise. It's not uncommon for some sort of disaster to hit. If you're involved in this, a drought can hit, something else can hit that cause your crops to fail. And the literature, when we started looking at this, was lined with stories of members who had contacted attorneys ready to sue because, Farmer X had been hit by a drought, unable to deliver crops, and they were ready to sue because they thought, we should be getting crops or produce all year round, not realizing that droughts could potentially limit some of that. And Ashley's laid out some of the problems that we saw with CSA contracts, but the literature shows it's not just a Maryland problem, it's a national problem. I should point out that the main reason we got involved in this project was it was concerns from Maryland Department of Agriculture, who had had phone calls based on complaints by CSA customers as produce not being delivered during times of drought. So the question was, how do we develop something that would help explain these issues to CSA customers and help the operators better understand some of the risks that go into the contracts involved in these operations. So as Ashley pointed out, and I shared the link up there, there's a link that is a website up there that has all of our information that we developed as a part of this project. There are links to the model contract that I'm going to talk about, both a Word document and a PDF document. We're about to put up an update to that. There were some other comments that came in after we had finalized it for the contracting guide of thoughts people thought we should add in, so we've kind of finalized that. The goal was to make it very understandable, plain English, not lawyer talk, and make it something that you would want to utilize in your operation. I say we're finalizing it in the PowerPoint. I forgot to update this slide. We have finalized it. It is available online. We're working on updating it slightly so it's ready to go for people that want to use it for the next season. And the contract will cover a lot of areas that are typically seen in the CSA models, not areas that are typically covered in everyone's contract, as Ashley's kind of pointed out. Like I said a minute ago, we tried to keep legalese to a minimum. One thing as we started talking to CSA operators and people around the country was we realized that for the most part, no one wants to use a contract full of legalese. So we tried to keep that to a minimum, keep it in plain English. We've had a couple of people review it and try to help limit some of that. We want to do something that creates a better marketing tool for you in your CSA and shows how your farm is going to operate, something you can utilize in that CSA contract. And we often have to point out we are not the only source of these model contracts. There's a website called farmcommons.org that does a really good job on a lot of this information. Connecticut Extension also has these available. And there are other resources available online. Just a simple Google search brought me to a couple of these, but I didn't want to list them all out there. So you can find other contracts out there that you may want to potentially utilize in your operation. And the other thing to point out when we started putting this out was we developed this to cover all potential issues that have been seen before. We're lawyers. Our job is to be overcautious. If you don't like it, you can always work with an attorney or try to figure out what's going to work best on your own. But we always tell you, if you're going to do this, try to attempt to at least work with a qualified attorney in your area. The contract is going to cover, these 7 common areas: growing practices, products and deliveries, risk of crop failure, what happens in a crop surplus, membership fees, how you're going to communicate with them, and then an indemnification and hold harmless clause. And we'll talk about each one of these quickly as we go along. So with growing practices, many of you are already utilizing certain growing practices on your farm. You're probably either certified organic, organically grown, grass-fed, grain-fed, GMO-free. I just listed a few of the hot topics right now on that, but there's some way you're potentially growing these crops and marketing them to the public. Why do you want to put this in your contract? It's on your website, right? As Ashley talked about, isn't it kind of repetitive? It can be repetitive, but it acts as a reminder. Down the road, members may forget what those growing practices were, and if they have the agreement with them, it shows it off automatically. It also acts as sort of a final ability to show people what the growing practices are on the farm. And if a dispute ever arises on what your growing practices are, it's spelled out in the contract. And we don't have to go back and look at your website and hope a court will incorporate that in, like Ashley talked about earlier. So how do you do this in your wet contract? It's pretty simple with the way we have the model contract done. You can copy and paste it in from your own website. And the thing that a lot of people, as we talk to them about this, is to remember that, your CSA contract is just another way to market the CSA, but you want it to be clear and the exact practices you're using and really not try to add the fluff on in the contract. You can add the fluff in on your website, but keep it to a minimum on that. So we tried to keep the legalese to a minimum. You try to keep the fluff to a minimum on some of this stuff when you incorporate it into the contract. And as we go along, if you have any questions, type them in the chat box. I will try to remember to look up there from time to time to answer some of them. Products and deliveries members should expect. What products are you currently growing right now? When are the products available? There are growing seasons for everything. And you have to remember your established customers may know what the growing season is. The new members may potentially be more accustomed to shopping in a supermarket where they can get everything year-round no matter the growing season. They may have never bought locally from a CSA or a farmer's market to understand that produce is not available year-round in a local market. How do you demonstrate this? Well, you can just put a chart in the contract that simply shows what you're growing and a delivery range. It may not always be right, but It may be from certain times of the year, each year, certain produce is available. It's going to be similar to what we saw many of you are already doing on your website. So you can, again, just copy and paste a lot of that same language into the CSA contract that we have available online. And this question came up quite a few times is, I grow a large number of crops. This list is going to be huge. Again, it's the best thing to do is include a list in your contract, but you can always potentially reference back to your website and just say, there's X page on my website that sort of lists out all this. So going back to John's question on referencing and appendixing, you can do that in there, but make sure you're clear, and if you change it on your website, you make sure it reflects that same way in the contract. So you may be only able to update your contract or your website once a year when you can update the contract as well. You don't want to change that stuff around once it's available and written into the contract. This is another issue that came up mainly because MDA constantly kept pointing it out. When you're looking at the size of delivery and you're using a specific weight or volume on that, keep in mind that if you're using specific weights on that, you're going to have to get all your scales checked out with Maryland Department of Ag's Weights and Measures Division. They typically offer a period of time each year where you can go get those checked for free. And potentially if you're already selling at farmers markets and you're using weight, you're already having to get those scales checked out. But if you haven't done that in the past, you're going to want to do that just to keep yourself from having a complaint filed against you with the Department of Ag. The other thing to make sure is when you're doing this, as this is in the model contract, you want to make sure to include delivery locations and the days to pick up at each place. If you have multiple delivery locations and they get to pick, make sure you allow them to check the box and it's very clear that they know where they're going to go pick it up at, and you know where they're going to go pick it up. And if there are any requirements to pick that share up, just make sure it's very clear and it's available for them to know what's going to happen before it happens. And then specify what happens to the share if it's not picked up. So if it's not picked up and you deliver it to the local food bank, or you turn around and use that produce somewhere else in the operation, just make sure they're aware of what the penalty is for not picking up the produce. And they don't just expect it to be freely available for them to pick up at your house whenever they feel like it. And this goes back to what Ashley was talking about earlier with the parole evidence rule. And Ashley's kind of hit upon this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But as she's talked about, it's a contracting rule used by courts that can limit or exclude evidence that clarifies the contract. So the idea is that we want the contract to reflect all the negotiations that took on, and we don't want to look at outside documents. So you may at least want to make sure that, if you're referencing in the contract, you're clear on this. You want to clarify everything. So if there is a dispute, it goes back and where it's very clear and we know where to go back and look, especially on your website. The one thing in talking to producers when we put all this together was we realized that most people want short, sweet, and to the point, but short, sweet, and to the point can come back to bite you in the butt and hurt you at times. So there's kind of an internal conflict that potentially goes on there with short and sweet. And as John highlighted earlier, there are ways to use appendixes and reference back to spots on your website. Or you can just, include, printouts of those websites to your potential members, especially if some of them don't have internet access or don't use the internet. Risk of crop failure is another area in the contract. We all recognize that, especially in agriculture, crop failures do happen, disease, drought, you name it. But are your shareholders or members, or however you define your customers in your CSA, do they understand that? And you want to remind them that this is possible. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier, that, a lot of your shareholders or members may have just had the experience of buying in the grocery store. Everything's always available at the grocery store. They may not realize that this is a potential problem, that disease or crop failure could happen. And the other reason to remind them is this is the area where Maryland Department of Agriculture gets the most complaints, and that's what led to a lot of the work that was done through this project. And it's also the problem that happens across the country as to when crop failure or drought or crop failures happen. and CSAs stop delivering, customers may get mad and start looking for attorneys. Potentially your clientele is more likely to have access to attorneys and be more willing to take legal action than potentially other groups are. And like I say, you want to reinforce this idea. You want to drive it home with this section. One change that's not in the model contract right now that will be available hopefully later this week is the idea that now we make you have to initial beside the box that recognizes that you saw that there was a crop failure. So if you're the shareholder, you have to initial by that. So that means you at least had to take the moment to read it, hopefully, before you initialed it. The other thing to point out with is how have you dealt with crop failure in the past. So if you've had a practice before of how you've dealt with it, make sure your members are aware of it. One of the issues that had happened before the Maryland Department of Agriculture's complaints were, they stopped delivering to the CSA customers, but they were still continuing to make deliveries to whoever the wholesaler was that they had to make deliveries to. So you may want to make clear that, you will try to deliver to CSAs, but your main area that you have to deal with is this wholesaler contract, if that is a potential issue down the road. The other area to put in there is, how do you deal with crop surpluses? You have to deal with crop failures. You also ought to think about how do you deal with crop surpluses. You may not think this is going to be a potential problem. No one probably is going to complain if they have access to more food, but it's just something to at least explain to them what the process was. You probably already handle this probably through your website, newsletters, social media accounts, something that helps make them aware of what the situation is. But again, you just want to do it, include it in, so in case there ever is a dispute, like I said, we're overcautious in how we develop this. You want to have simple language in there like we put in the model contract that just reminds them to pay attention to the newsletter, social media accounts, websites, however you normally reach them, just to make them aware that there potentially could be crop surpluses. Membership fees. It's important early on to at least explain to these, and we tried to do a good job of trying to put together language in the model contract to help explain to them what the membership fee is going to be so they know how much the share is going to cost, and it takes away any surprises. So if they have to pay so many times throughout the season, they know what that is automatically. If you're only going to accept credit cards, checks, or something, PayPal, Square, however you're accepting payments, you just want to make sure that's clear, it's spelled out for them, and they understand what all the issues are as well. The question we got asked a lot as we did the workshops earlier in the spring was, how do you price these things? And I'm still not sure exactly how you go about pricing these things and how you price a membership fee. It's going to depend on a lot of factors: market for products, size or share, cost of production. So a lot of the economics that you're putting in this, you may have to talk with more established farmers. If you're starting out new in this, just try to get an idea of what the cost of a share should be. The final little point from the CSA model contract was just laying out early on how this communication is going to take place between you and your members. So, we have to face it, crop situations are going to change day to day depending on what the weather is, the conditions are, and you're going to want to spell out some easy way that they're going to expect you to communicate with them. Most likely, it's almost always going to be through email, but communication preferences can change. They may, expect, you post something on Twitter where they can see it, or Facebook. Although Facebook does have a tendency to hide stuff if you're not checking that page quite frequently. So you may want to just remember to highlight, newsletters, social media accounts, any way potential that you're going to be able to communicate with them so they're aware that they can go on one of these sites and be made aware of what the farm is. You can also, help them out by posting pictures to show them what the conditions are on the farm. So if there is a drought and a crop failure, they're more likely to understand early on. But this is a lot of stuff most of you are already doing in your farms anyway. We're just trying to reiterate it's stuff, to continue doing and add into the contract to make people aware of how to find this stuff. And it, like it said, it keeps them aware of what the day-to-day conditions are. And they're more likely to understand what's going to happen in event of a crop failure. The last area, which a lot of people don't like in this contract, is there was added in an indemnification and hold harmless clause, and this is included in most protections. Basically, the clause is the idea is to reduce your legal exposure if a member is injured while visiting the farm in the event of a crop failure, or if they crack a tooth on a piece of produce. And we included what the model language is in the model contract at the bottom. The idea is that basically by signing it, they say, if something bad happens, it's not the farm's fault, it's not the employees of the farm's fault. It's just another added legal protection in there that's seen in a lot of contracts. Many of you may not like it, but it's in there in case you do see a need for it. So to kind of wrap up, we kind of pointed out these things aren't a simple document as most people would think they are. There's going to need to be a lot of issues addressed in this. And we've tried to address those in the model contract, growing practices, delivery, risk of failure, surpluses, membership fees, that type of stuff. Will your contract have to include all these sections? No. It's just going to depend on your operation. You may have to add in extra sections. You may have to take out sections. You may have to change up some of these. The always thing I say is, when you develop a model contract, you kind of develop it as if everybody's generic, and not everybody's generic in their operations. The operations are going to change, and things will have to be specific in how they're done. So these contracts can be changed based on, your need. And the other thing is point out, you're free to pick and choose however you want to utilize this. Feel free to modify it to fit your operation. And if you do that, consider having an attorney review it with you to help make sure everything is on the up and up once you're done with it. And I think that's everything I have.
Thank you for watching our archived presentation of our Wednesday webinar. If you would like to see more archived Wednesday webinars, please visit our YouTube channel. Or to find a schedule of upcoming live webinars, visit our website.